Yeah, so we see the little red light there, and this is now being recorded, this session. And warmly welcome to you all to come to this webinar, and also warmly welcome to you of those who listen this recording later on. And we will have a UArctic thematic network on teacher education webinar presentation, and this time it's produced from Canada, from Manitoba, University of Manitoba, and Professor Frank Deer is giving the presentation about Indigenous language education in public education in Canada. And this is a very interesting topic, and especially very well fit the UNESCO International Year of Indigenous Languages as well. And sorry, I forgot to my my camera on. So hello, I'm Tuija, and I'm the chairing this network. But with these words, Frank, the floor is yours, and you will have time your presentation, and then there will be some time also for the questions, and we can use the chat box for questions. So please write your questions down while you are listening, and then we will have a nice conversation after that. But please, Frank, the floor is yours.
Yawagoa, Sego, Sawagwagum. Arun Yodas Yunjats in my language. My name is Arun Yodas, and I'm happy to take part here. I'll take one moment or two to just chat about myself and who I am. I am a professor, Canada Research Chair at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg. Winnipeg is right in the middle of Canada. I'm originally from Ganawage, which is a community just south of Montreal. And that is a Ganyakehaga territory, Mohawk, if you will, to use the exonym. But for the last 25 odd years, I've been living in Winnipeg, which is not Mohawk territory. It is Treaty 1 territory. It's the territory of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, and others. The Métis call this their homeland as well. And in preparing for this presentation, I found it difficult to talk about Indigenous language education without getting, to some extent, into some of the context in which these issues rest. I know when speaking with some of the people who are members of the thematic network that the sort of social and political contexts matter in their respective jurisdictions, and that's true of mine. So although I'm not here to talk about the politics or the social developments over the last 200 years or so in central Canada and elsewhere, they may become a part of the conversation. I welcome your questions if you have any about that point. So I'm also, as a Canada Research Chair, responsible for a number of projects that I'm doing, and they all have some strong connection to Indigenous language education. I'm not a linguist, but I do delve into structure, meaning, symbolism that as it's manifest in language, and some of the things that are really quite important to the development of such things as programming and resources. That's essential to some parts of Indigenous language education. I am by trade a school administrator. I have been a classroom teacher, and I come to this sort of work with those experiences and that perspective in mind. So this presentation is on the back of one project that I'm doing amongst 4 or 5 that have something to do with Indigenous language education in Canada. So, and with this project, it was more of concern for the administrative dimensions of Indigenous language education. And there are other projects where I get into such things as the politics of dialect use, about what work is being done in and around more endangered languages in Manitoba and in Canada. Um, so there is a lot to say about Indigenous language education here, but it's difficult to talk about that without talking about, of course, at a high level, the Indigenous peoples of Canada. So the discussion about that can be understood to be very regional. As I said before, I am a Mohawk person from Ganawage, which is in what the province that you might know of as Quebec. There are a number of languages that are nominally the principal languages of Indigenous peoples in Manitoba. There are 5 what we call First Nations languages. There is Anishinaabe-Moan, which is the language of the Anishinaabe, or the Ojibwe, if you will. There is the Cree language groups. There are Dakota. There is a language group called Oji Cree, and there is the Dene, which is the people of the far north. But of course, over time, other languages have either been introduced or actually developed in Manitoba, the language of Michif of the Métis peoples. And I say the language of Michif, but there are a variety of different languages within the Michif group, which are not dialects under a particular root language. And Winnipeg and Manitoba is one of the largest areas in which Inuit peoples from the far north have moved to for a variety of reasons, and their language and their culture and their identity is a part of the Manitoba and Southern Canadian, if you will, social fabric. And there is some concern to differing extents, admittedly, about the state of many languages. What began the conversation in the contemporary sense, I'll say, is on the back of work that was done by Heritage Canada about 10 years ago, where they concluded that only 3 languages in Canada would be, in their words, viable of the 70, and 70, I'll say there's 70 Indigenous languages. You'll get different sources that have different numbers, and that is down to the particulars of whether or not a language is a language unto itself or a dialect. It's an interesting discussion, a bit off the beaten path for this talk, but there's about 70. And the 3 are Anishinaabe-Moan, or Ojibwe, Cree, and one strand of Inuktitut, which is the language of the Inuit peoples. And by viable, they were understood to mean would continue to be used in beyond the next few generations. And others are endangered and are without intervention of some sort would disappear. So the state of Indigenous languages is to a variety of different degrees endangered in many ways. And there is a history behind that. Among other things, the Indian residential school experience has been one that's been studied for a long time, but it's been a special topic for many peoples in Canada, and the impacts that that's had on the culture and languages of Indigenous peoples in much of Canada is studied, and a lot is made of that, necessarily so. You can imagine generations of children who have been taken from their families and put into residential schools for numerous years, and have the language and culture, in a sense, beaten out of them. It has had an effect. And there is a phenomenon that is sometimes referred to as intergenerational trauma. So although one may not say of themselves that they are a person who attended a residential school or an Indian day school and had those experiences for themselves. But if they are the descendant of somebody, that there is some impacts that are very serious, and the loss of language is certainly one of them. But there are of course others. And I hope to come back to some of the issues in Canada and how that maps onto this in a bit. So there are a lot of factors. If you didn't attend residential school, there are other things that are, of course, no doubt at work there, whether you had residential schools or not, through a long period of colonization and now post-colonial interface. You of course have the lingua franca of English and French, depending on where you are in Canada, at work, and that is to the detriment of the use of many Indigenous languages. There are many who are very concerned that if you don't have a purpose or a reason to use your language, it will also be lost. And some look to the influence of how French and English have impacted our peoples. I'm from Quebec, so it was English and French. That was, of course, the principal languages of use in schools, through business, through commerce, and so on. So it's a very important consideration for where we are. But happily, there have been many things that have occurred in the last, I'd say, a quarter of a century that have affected for the better the course that we're on for valuing, recognizing, affirming, and supporting the development of, among other things, Indigenous languages. That is a topic that has been, amongst others, been put at the feet of public education in Canada. I could get into the way in which primary and secondary education is dealt with in Canada, but for the largest source of primary and secondary education, if you will, in Canada is the public school systems that are managed by each and every province. There's no federal program for public schooling in Canada, but there are First Nation schools because since, as I said, in the last 25 years, part of those developments have been the provision of opportunities for First Nations, First Nation Indigenous communities to manage their own schools, and they've dealt with things differently, but they have serious funding programs, among other things, that are issues. So the changes that have occurred in the last quarter of century have had to do with responding to the undesired consequences of residential school and Indian day school involvement, the impacts of government interface with Indigenous communities, and some of the problematic policies and legislations that have occurred since the Dominion of Canada in the late 19th century. So one of the things that have occurred is public schools not denying any longer, whether overtly or tacitly perhaps, that there's no place for Indigenous languages in schools. Now they recognize and affirm that, in part because the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada has had a lot of acceptance in Canada. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, by the way, was the commission that was charged with the responsibility of understanding the residential school experience, and what we can do to be responsive to Canada's poor relationship with Indigenous peoples. There are a variety of things going on in the final report and the calls to action that came out in 2015, and education figured centrally in that. In the words of the Chief Commissioner, education got us in this mess, and education will get us out. So affecting, among other levels of education, those of primary and secondary schooling is really quite important. So you have, in the last for, 10, 20 years, many school divisions thinking to themselves, what can we do? How can we go about this? How can we provide better programming, and how, and this has really been central to these discussions in maybe the last few years. It's really quite recent. Well, what can we do to improve Indigenous language programming? There are, of course, some challenges, but I want to start off by recognizing how important that is, that public schools have begun to take up this challenge in support of this. So there are a number of things that I think many schools are concerned about, especially those in urban areas for which connection with particular Indigenous communities of particular language groups is slightly problematic, and the diversity of Indigenous representation in urban areas is, for instance, an issue that administrators in public schools have to deal with. And there are other things as well that I hope to address here. So currently, as I said before, there are a number of languages that are regarded as viable. The Heritage Canada reports survey of those three, I would still agree with at this point, even though I think we've learned a bit more about the state of some languages. There was a researcher called Leanne Hinton who did a survey of languages. She's more of a linguist than I, and talked about the difference between differing levels of endangerment for languages. So if you look her up and some of her work, I think you'll find that there's some interesting sort of surveys of what constitutes an endangered language. I do my work in the North, and in discussing these results of this work thus far, I have to say that although a language like Cree, which has been described as being viable because it may still exist as a spoken form of communication in many communities, as being viable for the next few years, the problems at the community level are sometimes difficult to map onto that. And there are some, for instance, communities that do have public schools in their First Nation communities. Now, what that might result in is an administrative structure that, although nominally values Indigenous languages as a form of education in their schools, it appears only to stretch that far. Now, I don't want to get too down the road of describing things in such a deficit way. There are some school districts who are doing fantastic work in Canada and have a legacy of dealing with Indigenous languages in a good way. And some of the things that they've done to enable this is really remarkable. And I'll pick up on that later on in this presentation. The current trend. I think most school districts are concerned as much with the sort of clientele they work with and describing that as they are providing programming. There are some who are caught in this situation where the preoccupation with understanding who Indigenous students are is a necessary step, but it's actually quite a challenging step as well. Not unlike First Nation schools that might be schools that operate in, for instance, remote territories where there is understandably a more uniform student population, and I've worked in some schools of that sort. It might be trivially easy to identify the sort of families and communities you're working with, the sorts of processes and protocols you will have to undertake in order to understand what the community wishes out of these schools and programs, and what sort of programming thus you would provide. It's not necessarily that simple in urban areas or other areas for which there are a variety of different, divergent at times, concerns. So the current trend is this stage of understanding, and any serious investment, it seems, will take place. But I think we're at a point where investment, sometimes some radical, as I would describe them, approaches to human resources issues and program issues has yielded some interesting interesting insights that I hope to pick up on here. So here you have a map of Canada. I had this. I don't know if I'm going to speak to it very much, but there is at times different ways in which you can articulate a person. I think everybody can understand this point here, that you may say of yourself that you are identity X. Okay, I introduced myself earlier as a Kanien'kehá:ka person and Kanien'kehá:ka scholar, and that's a national claim. It's also a language grouping claim. It's not so much a treaty claim, not really, but I live in an area where the treaty, the treaty groupings, if you will, are really quite strong, and that maps onto nationalism in some ways that language doesn't. I think we're going to come back to that, but in terms of how school divisions, public school divisions, are responding to the calls to action for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, they're doing so with such things as increased, not language education, some are, but increased exploration of treaty education and treaty issues and treaty history, which might seem like a different sort of animal, but it is important to consider where not just resources are going, but the manner in which people are engaging in and use what's customary in schools for engaging in programming. And this is one of the challenges for language education. It's actually quite a departure from the way in which something as delineated and codified as treaty education may be addressed in schools, okay? And this is true of probably a lot of curriculum that we could all think about, where a teacher has gone through his or her or their respective education, they do their respective professional development exercises, and then it will approach something like treaty education as a very important, from a curricular sense, resource issue. By that I mean the resources that one employs in order to explore something. And it's quite interesting to me that many teachers rely on teacher resources like the Manitoba Treaty Education resource, something you pull off the shelf, have a look. There's Black Line Masters. We've all seen it before. And have an exploration of the Canadian Indigenous experience on the back of treaties. And it's work. It's relatively easy, and in some ways, for some, it's easy because you only have to think about one thing, and that's the treaty dimensions of someone's or a group's or a community's identity, and you could explore it in that way. Language is a whole lot different in a lot of ways. It requires a whole lot more work, and it requires specialized human resources, and it requires in some cases, not yet available resources that can support student learning. So Indigenous language education, it seems to me, is quite a bit different than other forms of Indigenous education that we could talk about later, I suppose. So the study is one that has occurred in a number of school districts in Manitoba, and thus far we have very, very rich narrative from many places. We were looking at exploring this issue with education professionals in schools and school districts. That became more of a communal issue as the study went on, and I hope to cover why that needed to happen later. And I do hope to cover the rest of Manitoba at the moment. My CRC is very localized. It's very Manitoba based. If there's any other Canadians on the line here, they'll understand that CRCs are sometimes national or global in scope. But my program, and I hope there's some sort of understanding of why this is, had to be necessarily very localized because of such a relatively new uh, program of research and or program of study. I think that a focus on the diversity in such a large place like Manitoba was really quite important as a beginning stage to this general exploration of languages in the long term. So I wish to understand how public school districts in Manitoba are responding to the educational imperatives associated with Indigenous language programming. Of course, any responsiveness is sometimes aligned with initiatives. It's aligned with such things as policy development. Not all school districts have gone so far as to affect policy in this way, but many have. Some have not affected their HR work yet as much as others. There are different school districts, it's clear to me, are at such different places with this. Many have been very, very committed to hiring, to going the way of even having in-house resource development, which is a very expensive undertaking and is a departure from when I was a teacher and you just relied on somebody who provided resources like textbooks, video resources, and even other communal resources that were all just there. But we're dealing with something quite different in regard to Indigenous language education, which is perhaps a symptom of how new this endeavor is. So I had hoped to investigate community and public school involvement. At the outset, it was really just public school at the administrative level, but the community issues became too important to ignore. I wished to explore this in disciplinary subjects. Thus far, it seems to me that there is some incisive work happening in some disciplinary areas wherein it's not happening in others. But of course, there's other issues here like pedagogical considerations, PD, staffing, and other factors. And also, I wish to examine the importance of Indigenous languages in supporting social and cultural identity development. There are some who will ask the sometimes irritating but fair question about why. Why would you do this? Why engage in Indigenous language education when, as I said a moment ago, when there's a number of studies that have said this, that some Indigenous languages might be out of existence soon, or some are so endangered, or that they're simply not a part of the lingua franca of a region. Why do it? And I wish to get an understanding of that. So, and I hope to speak to those, all of those. So, this wasn't going to be a quantitative study in any way. I approached this from a grounded theory approach, and I did some constant comparative in this way, and I wrote that I'm currently aggregating student achievement data, but that's not necessarily a part of what I want to speak to here today. The student achievement data actually became less useful because of how little there actually is. So some school districts have different ways in which they store and are willing to share achievement data, and some of them are just their programming is so recent that it was difficult to say anything about it. So thus far, I spoke about urban diversity previously. I'm not sure if I'm surprised by this, but urban school districts have approached this in a far more aggressive manner than their non-urban counterparts. And that seemed the only reason that I'm not sure if I'm surprised by that, I suppose I expected perhaps that the diversity in urban communities would mean that they would be reticent or unwilling to be as aggressive in that way. But I was happily surprised that school districts that have, for instance, three different their student body and their communities represent three different language groups, that it was going to be very difficult to minister to their needs in a just way. But some have, and for those that have addressed the diversity, it seems that urban school districts have done a better job of that. Because of the funding that's on offer, many of these school districts have been in receipt. There has been a change in government, so it's changed a little bit, but not much. A blanket funding support program for Indigenous education, not non-Indigenous language education, but Indigenous education. So, and there was or rather, is different ways in which school districts may use that grant. And so long as they're reporting on the use of those monies in a way that ministers the needs of Indigenous education, then that's fine. So some have used it, for instance, to be looking at particular Native studies at the senior years sort of programming, but and some used it for Indigenous language education, and some were using existing funding in their existing baseline as well, which I was happy to see. I was happy to see that the AAA program was what they called it, the Aboriginal Academic Achievement Program, that they used their monies for that, but they also used some of their baseline money at the district and the school levels to support these programs. Otherwise stated, in a situation where they can choose to support Indigenous education or not, some school districts, particularly those in urban areas, did choose to use their limited funding to support this. Perhaps an example of understanding that there is an issue here that they wish to be responsive for. There are some curious ways in which some of these programs have been ministered. So because of and I'll talk about human resources in a minute, but because everything's so limited in terms of who can support Indigenous language education, many school districts that I have looked at have approached this from a centralized point, where they have what you can call itinerant teachers who go from school to school to school in the school district, supporting this program, where they'll spend a pre-planned amount of time with one school with not necessarily the same age or grade levels, and be working with them in Indigenous language education, as opposed to having a decentralized school-based program. That's not true of all school districts. Some have been doing some fantastic stuff, but the centralized approach can be seen in a negative light. There is a movement in many school districts in other disciplines to have school leadership development, to have school capacity developed at that level and nowhere else. But it just doesn't appear in many places to be a reasonable way to do it, in part because there's simply not enough people out there who are knowledgeable and trained to fill these roles. So a itinerant approach, a centralized approach, is one that some have developed. I did a study. It's not Indigenous language, but it was a case study of Indigenous education in a school district, one school district, because I was fascinated by the approach of Indigenous education that both had centralized aspects and decentralized aspects as well. And there is, perhaps this is no surprise now, but the centralization appeared to be more in line with the supports for early and middle years students. so primary education, basically. In secondary contexts, you saw more schools with their own capacity that wasn't a part of the centralized format. The inference I made, and it's only an inference, is that the disciplinary focus that's prevalent in secondary schools means that you have this developing there. So if you have a Native Studies teacher with Native Studies programming, that reality lends to the development of something that's more school-based, which is I could see as valuable. It just doesn't happen in regard to Indigenous language education, but it happens with Indigenous education, generally speaking. When asked about how you bring resources to bear, that was probably one of the more tough situations that many educators find themselves in. For those who do have the beginnings of or a proven successful Indigenous language program, the resources are not necessarily on offer, and some of them may only be partially useful. So, for example, one school district in northern Manitoba had what I would call the strongest program I've ever seen in regard to Indigenous language education in terms of teachers, number of teachers, their expertise, the sorts of the community school relationship, very, very strong. But they had a serious resource issue because it's a Cree community, but Cree could be understood in Manitoba to be at least 2 different dialects. The use of a dialect in one area for which there's no resources mean you're drawing resources that reflects another dialect. Now that might seem trivial, but the political issues that the community notices is really quite at times an issue. But many school districts have tried to use existing technology to do that, and an often cited trope of sorts is the smartphone app for languages. I think we've all seen them. And for languages that are the focus of this study, I think there's at least a few apps out there that are common, and some of them are free, some of them you have to pay for on your phone. Is they're there and they can be used and they can be great resources in some contexts. So what I'm finding with this study is that there's almost, if I approach this from a critical perspective, there's almost an overuse of technology of that sort in some schools, okay? And there's a serious problem with using technology like a language app to enable language education and so on, right? Now, the principal reason, I can get into a lot of them, but I'll just pick on maybe 1 or 2. One is the way in which language apps operate. Whether we realize it or not, we could have a conversation about this if you like. Those apps privilege something. They privilege, in the cases of the ones I use or have seen, they privilege the English language. It's almost an exercise in saying that I have this word in English. What does it mean in this language, right? Which doesn't seem like a terrible question to ask. We all want to know, right? So if we said something about, I just lost my page here. Oh, there we go. If I may give you an example, okay? You would have seen, if you're paying attention, on the first slide of this presentation, I had at the bottom of the slide the day of the week, the date, today's date, right? So in my language, you would use the word for Tuesday. Today's Tuesday, right? So someone might say, oh, how do I say the word Tuesday in Mohawk? So I'll go to my app and I'll see the word posted, and then I might be very happy that I know a word in Mohawk that I previously knew in English. Okay, but imagine if you privileged the Indigenous language first, and you asked yourself, well, what's either at least what does Rarirun Yakiranunga mean in English, which you'd get a very different answer than saying, oh, that means Tuesday. Or if you had an opportunity to understand the bridge between that English word and the Indigenous language representation of that concept, first of all, you would have not just an understanding of what a word in Indigenous language really means, other than the dictionary-like lexicographic representation, but you would also have a narrative there. Okay? So if you do the reverse of that translation and you say, what does Rarirun mean in English? Oh, I go Tuesday. Well, no, it doesn't mean that. It actually, it may be understood to translate to the phrase Day of Angels. It doesn't mean Tuesday, but we use the word to represent Tuesday. I come from a community that has a connection with the Roman Catholic Church. There's a narrative associated with that is both from the biblical canon and from the community. And there are all kinds of lovely stories that emerge from that isn't necessarily germane to the translation you wish to get, but you get an understanding of the people associated with that word. And I think that's very important, and that's lost or potentially lost when you rely on the lexicographic preoccupation with translation. I'm just concerned with translating. That's it. I don't really care about meaning. If you have that approach, that's an issue. Some have suggested that you could retain a language but still lose the meaning. And that's almost as bad in some ways to losing the language itself. So the technology use can be useful as a resource, but it does miss that important step of understanding meaning. Again, there are some linguists who do a great job of explaining this better than I, but there are some potentials there that I think need to be considered. That brings me to the next point, which is about staffing, because in order to cause learning in classes for which meaning needs to be explored, for which you want an appropriate, culturally relevant exploration of whatever content you're exploring, and have it in an Indigenous language, or you're just exploring Indigenous languages in and of themselves in a language exercise, then you need qualified, learned staffing teachers who are generally associated with the communities for which the language emerges. Now, you don't always, I would say, require somebody from the community, but there are times when, like my dialect example previously, that might be quite important. There are different ways of enabling staffing to do this, but you do have a terribly difficult time recruiting teachers who can work in language fluency exercises in the class. They simply don't have the fluency that's there. Again, going back to the impacts of school, residential school experiences and other things in our history mean that only some people do still have their respective Indigenous language. So the staffing issue is quite a pressing one. Some school districts, I used the word, maybe I used the word radical earlier. Some of them are very committed and aggressive with this sort of thing, have developed some interesting ways to try to support this. From a HR sort of imperative perspective, many are concerned with enlisting teachers, getting them hired, understanding their qualifications, and sending them off to teach. There were some examples in this study of those who understood that the staffing issue is pressing and approached this quite differently, where they took the PD models that might be beneficial to supporting Indigenous language teaching and employing them in a very expensive but important way. For instance, one school district was hiring, but there was this interim period which did not constitute the probationary period, where you'll do some work in the schools, but comparatively less than anybody else, and instead we're going to invest in you to attend language programming, language camps, and other exercises to ensure that you are ready, not to teach, because we understand you're ready to teach, but ready to converse and teach in whatever Indigenous language that you're hired for. So there's some examples of that in that. Not many. It's a very expensive undertaking, but that's what's been explored. Others have taken the student support worker role. Sometimes they're called educational assistants. Sometimes they're called family support workers. They're not teachers in that sense, but they have enlisted the administrative, the EA support, role in order to support that, because there are some people out there simply not qualified to be an independent full classroom teacher on their own, but they do have their language. So some school districts have tried their best to, within whatever parameters are available to them through the teacher collective agreements and other union issues, to ensure that they can support that in some ways. And I found that fascinating as well. But I'm sorry, this is a tangent, but I first went to school in 1980 in kindergarten. I don't know what you'd call it in your jurisdictions, but you're 5 years old. It's your first school experience. And when I was an early, when I was a youth, let's call it, the community that I lived in began to take control of their own programming, and they did so in a rather aggressive way. And they wished to have Indigenous language programming, but they had the same problem that I'm describing here. They didn't have the requisite. They didn't have anybody with the requisite qualifications and certification to teach. So, and I wouldn't suggest anybody to do this, but at the time, 40 years ago, you hired a lot of janitors or a lot of cafeteria workers who weren't filling those roles at all. They were actually supporting language teachings in the school. And although I wouldn't suggest that now, but it was an example of how aggressive a community would be or has to be in order to do these sort of things. I've already talked about resident. I don't know why that's there. So there are some thoughts that I offer to you about this that might be of help. One, this preoccupation with translation in language education. I've begun to become very concerned about it, but it's not something that can be corrected very quickly with a policy development or a change in administration. This is something that, for instance, communities have to work on, that universities have to work in order to be dealing with this issue. I don't think I'm going to be talking too much in regard to these thoughts about community participation, but I do want to say a couple of words about that, because it seems to me that from my view, through my work and through that of others in Canada, this might be different in other places, the success stories, the successful examples of Indigenous language education had a very, very strong community dimension to it. Now, by community dimension, I mean that community was enlisted to work and actually share a bit of responsibility for the programming in a way that made sense. I'm listing these now so you can just all see them. Many had felt that it was important for the community to affect their own culture and climate in order to provide students, youth, children and youth, a opportunity to engage outside the school walls in the language, right? Any linguist would, in this area of talking about endangered languages, would suggest that in order to get somebody to speak a language, you have to give them a reason to speak the language. So that required some changes in the community and how they went about things. I'll give you one example of how that sort of played out. Is that the one community I'm thinking about from this work sort of partnered with the community, and the community actually developed community bylaws in regard to language, wherein they actually required, for instance, businesses and people in what you might call the public service to require them to speak the language during business hours or through whatever interface you had with a client if they required it. You would have, and it seemed sort of at a time when some people look at what's going on in Quebec and wonder about their language laws and their sign laws and something. This particular community was doing something very similar to the benefit of those who were leaving the school with that programming in mind, and they had a place to speak. That was really quite important. There are, I'm talking about Indigenous language education, but there are other things going on here. Yeah, I'm referring to number 2 here about these referents. So there are some times when I see some lovely programming going on that's not just about the Indigenous languages, but it maps onto something real. It maps onto something authentic. There are some who are engaging in experiential education, or what's popularly referred to in these parts as land-based education or education in a territory. And it gives people in a community a wonderful way of mapping on language, Indigenous language, with the things that are really real and important in a cultural sense. I supervise undergraduate students at my university, and that requires observing their lessons at times and going to the schools and watching them do the thing. And although this might happen elsewhere, I've never had the opportunity until recently. Where I went to a school, it was a senior year student, and there was a bit of language going on. I knew ahead of time. I arrived at 9 a.m. And it was a class as you might imagine it, the usual one. You're in a building in a room and you're talking about something, but 30 minutes after, it was very brief, and 30 minutes later, you're engaging in the topic, you're engaging in the language. We were in the middle of Lake Winnipeg, and it was they were doing work in the area of netting for fish, and they were employing the language, and they had people there who were teachers, and they had people there who were not teachers. They were people from the community, people committed to whatever was going on the lake that day, but also ostensibly committed to what was going on with the students learning. So I thought that was really quite important to have those experiences, those whether they're actual items or referents, as I refer to them, to engage with the language rather than something a little bit more abstract. It seems to me is becoming very, very important. And some school districts understand that. It's not just an academic exercise in a classroom. So in regard to responsibility, and this maps onto what I said earlier, and I'd love to hear what goes on in other countries and other regions, but public education is being charged with a lot to do a lot these days. And by extension, teachers are being required to cover a lot and to do a lot. It's something that I think is really quite important to observe, is how the community can have responsibility for a situation sort of like this. I can't help but notice when I didn't bear witness to anybody's decision making process to decide to engage with Indigenous language education at the district level, but it's certainly clear to me that the voice that's been offered to that to the pressure on school districts to do this, it emerges from the community. It's not really emerged from the provincial government, although they do say a few things um, that are rather encouraging. It's really coming from the people themselves, and I think that's really important to consider. That doesn't make the community responsible for developing Indigenous language programming. It certainly is an opportunity, however, to, as I suggested before, provide communities the opportunity to affect their climate and culture, to affect anything they can, to give people a reason to engage in the language. Yeah, I think I'm going to leave it at that. My work's not done. As I delve into this work on Indigenous languages, this is just an exploration of the administrative dimensions of this, but I can't help but notice, and I am currently writing a couple of pieces on this, the nature in which Indigenous languages is addressed at the community level. There's when you talk about with, for instance, a community group or a community elder about the opportunities for Indigenous language education, there are a few things that have reliably come up every single time. Issues of, I think we could generally refer to as spirituality, and how spirituality may figure into a community's consciousness and the learning of children and youth. Issues of nationalism, whether it's treaty issues, whether it's understanding who they are within a legislative context. And there's also sort of a issue that comes up quite frequently, and it's about the importance of community and particularly elders in Indigenous communities. Maybe not directly related to that, but it does emerge, right? Because people are very sensitive to the idea that this knowledge comes from somewhere, right? That or must come from somewhere. So, at a time when many communities wish to enable schools and their communities to provide some learning opportunities about their cultural fabric, there's some who realize that knowledge is just not there for you to pick up and use. It's got to come from somewhere, and many have done some lovely things about enabling elders to be, as much as reasonably possible, a part of these conversations and learning. Many schools have begun to understand that as well, and have, for instance, formalized the role of elder in their schools, where there are resident elders for a school district or even a particular school, and that is perhaps one of the referents that I was referring to earlier. Having someone there to offer the knowledge in an authentic way that's important to communities and important to children's learning. And luckily, we have people who are know their language and can sort of help in that way. Going back to the Heritage Canada study, not all communities have somebody, or they have very few. So it gets to this technology issue and the storage of their narratives. Some of them are doing a great job. There are some lovely Elder Treaty Series video resources out there in Canada that are making the rounds that people seem to find valuable. I'll close off with one quick story. because I spend a lot of time in communities for which the language is still there, really is in an important way. And some of them are working in schools. Some communities have, it's palpable that the language is still there. It's really quite important. Some of them are underfunded school districts. Some of them, are have some issues of poverty, but the language is still there, and that's really quite important. I visited a First Nation that was at the time just in receipt in the last 12 months of a very large federal grant to support programming. So I walked into the school. It was beautiful. It had all the bells and whistles. They had the smart boards or whatever in every room. They managed to maintain a 14-to-1 teacher-student ratio. It was really a beautiful school. In a community of about 550, they had 3 people left in the entire community who still had their language. None of them were affiliated with the school formally. All of them were over the age of 55. And it was at that point when that was described that the tone of the conversation was really quite sad, that you're potentially going to be that next news item that we've all seen, whether it was on the BBC or whatever, about some community that lost the last speaker of their language. There are some communities that are in that situation, and when you lose a language, you lose a part of your culture, if you will. You've heard maybe that. So, and maybe that is a very important reason to explore this topic. So, Nyawagoa, thank you very much. I invite your questions.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you very much for this thought-provoking presentation. And now the floor is to the audience of this presentation. If you have any questions in your mind or any comments, please feel free to write them to the chat box so that we can talk them further on. But I really like the framework you are having in your study, and how you are actually looking at the communities and what they need, and how they have overcome the challenges there. Obviously, there are a lot of them.
Yeah, and I have to admit to you that I think that was
Diane, you are writing, so please.
Oh, okay, there we go.
Yeah.
I'm going to read it actually out loud, if that's all right. I don't want to. Yeah. Thank you. I have many, but I'll start with an easy to type one. Have you seen non-Indigenous students participating in the Indigenous language learning opportunities? So the quick answer is yes, but very, very sparsely. So I'll draw upon 2 examples, Diane, that I think are really quite, that sort of maybe exemplify what I think the problem is here. Because you can imagine a school district that has a decentralized school-based approach to this. One of the districts in the study rejected the centralized approach, and they were looking at schools to become centers for language. And they also had to, of course, get assent from parents for their children to be in these sort of things, and so on. So, so my understanding is, in examples such as that, you had Indigenous students, in particular Anishinaabe students, in an Anishinaabe classroom. And there was very little exception to that, none that I saw, and none that was reported. For those that have the centralized approach, the itinerant approach, the opposite occurs, okay? That you do have mixed and potentially mostly non-Indigenous students receiving this programming, mostly at the earlier grades. It's all very rudimentary at times when the language is shared, which is okay as well. but exploring basic conversational Cree or Anishinaabe. But of course, it's an itinerant going from school to school. The school, whether they request it or they're instructed by the superintendent to receive it, will go into the classrooms, and they will have that programming go that way. And these aren't schools that have high numbers of Indigenous peoples necessarily. None of the schools that I've seen that are in public school districts have any policy or rules about having just Indigenous students in a particular class. There are one or two exceptions to that, but in terms of language programming, none. There's none. So it depends on whether or not it's a centralized or decentralized approach. For the decentralized school-based approach, they were it's as much a resource issue as anything, right? You usually only have one teacher per school, and understandably, that through recruitment or whatever recruitment exercise the principal or the administration engages in, we'll have mostly Indigenous students of families who want that to occur. So it is something, yeah, that you see different. It depends on the context and the way it's delivered. So again, I'll make one final point on that. I don't think any of us have to sort of think too hard about what might be more successful in the long term.
Yeah. Yeah. And then the next question is about social media as a resource for Indigenous language.
Okay, yeah. In Sami, in Sweden, social media is an important resource for Indigenous language use. Have you also seen that in your research? I've seen it. I don't think it's used as much in school programming, but it is certainly used for teacher professional development. I would say that. There are two people that I could think of who have worked very, very hard to bring Indigenous languages to people through social media, and some of them done it in interesting ways. I'm thinking of one. I don't have it off the top of my head. Maybe I should search later. It's someone who's developed a resource for memes. Do we know what a meme is? It's sort of an image with some text that usually picks up on a contemporary issue, sometimes in a humorous way, and so on. And there was someone who's used that format to develop language opportunities. Very episodic, very short. It's almost like word of the day toilet paper, but it's just something to get you thinking. I do that when there is in February Indigenous Language Month or whatever it's called, and I'll spend the entire month. Previously, I didn't do it last year. It's probably still on social media, where I would go through Mohawk words over and over again. And usually it's very basic. It's day of the week. It's whatever. But I would make sure of something in those exercises, having the word in English, having the word in my language, and having the proper meaning to drop on something I mentioned earlier. So I could have this, for instance, English and Cree word translation. It could be very helpful. Having that bridge between the two in terms of meaning, very important. Wow. Okay, Diane. In Alaska, as you know, we have many languages that are threatened. And in our urban areas, we also have many different Indigenous languages. In Anchorage, we now have a UPIC immersion program for early grades. I had a parent from a community that had mostly lost its language say they felt it was better for their child to learn UPIC than not have any Indigenous language if they couldn't have their own taught. I know you said there were challenges across different dialects from the same language family, but have you heard any places where they have any Indigenous language is better than none idea? maybe that is related to what you described between centralized and decentralized language provision. Okay, that's an excellent question. So I'm going to answer it in two ways. As you can imagine, Diane, yeah, I know that was a long question, Diane. As you can imagine, there are many non-Indigenous teachers and administrators who are interested in this. Okay, they have a very high level, low resolution understanding of the topic, right? I don't wish to say that in such a way that's denigrating of teachers. I love the ones who are doing this sort of work. But when it came time to discuss in one school district, and I didn't mention this, but I happened to be in the parent community consultation process for one school district in Manitoba before they actually implemented the program. They were still planning. And then the question came, what language do we do first? Which I felt was an important question, but it wasn't the sort of question I was going to have a quick answer. So the famous scholar Glenn Tinder said, you have a political situation when you have divergent interests, you have limited resources, and you have administration having to make a decision based on those two things. And that was the case there. And it was a case of having to settle on Anishinaabe-Moan at the expense of Cree. That created some sort of raised eyebrows amongst community and families. So that's really quite an issue. I don't think I would say it's the issue of centralized or decentralized, other than to say that you have a decision to address something at the expense of others. And in the diversity that I'm sure is the case in Alaska, you have that. So you have to make those decisions based on that. But I will make one thing, the issue I'm thinking about, and it's also, I didn't raise this during the presentation, but in one case, we had one community that was doing Cree language education. Okay, this is a dialect issue. And when people wanted to do, you'll have communities that have a Plains Cree dialect versus a Woods Cree dialect. They're not terribly different on paper, okay, but they are different in other ways, in the spoken word for sure. So this has not been a new problem. It's been a problem that's been there a very long time, and there have been moves to standardized Cree, to standardize in spite of the differences in dialect. I think we could all sort of understand some fundamental rationale for why that's important to do. But when you standardize a language, you have to sort of understand what you're doing at the what sort of problems that you have in regard to those that are not necessarily a part of that standardization. Standardization might be necessary at an administrative level, but if done incorrectly, you are potentially excluding, you're potentially marginalizing other communities and other agents in that area. And that's an ongoing problem. The language of the Métis is really quite interesting as well. They're not all dialects. There are some you might say there's a small group of Michif languages that are similar, but that standardization takes a different form. It's too much to talk about now, but with different, very different, linguistically speaking, languages, one regional government decided that one of them is the official one. That Michif Cree, it's called, is the official language, and that might be one way of standardizing something. It's not really standardization, but you're saying something's important at the expense of others, and it's just something you have to do and deal with the political fallout because of that. But it does occur. It does occur.
Okay, Thank you, Frank, and thank you for your questions. And this recording will be available afterwards, so you can tell your colleagues as well that they can come and listen to this this presentation. But thank you all, and thank you, Frank. It was great to have you online here.
Yawagoa, my language. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.